The silence was deafening. 10 seconds earlier, Dean Martinez, 3-time state champion and the pride of Elite Combat Academy, had been smirking confidently as he faced off against the beginner who had wandered into their advanced class. Now he lay flat on his back, his hands slapping the mat frantically in submission, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Helen Albright rose gracefully from the mat, her dark skin glistening with barely a hint of sweat, her expression calm, as if she had just completed a simple warm-up drill rather than dismantling the ego of a man who had spent the evening mocking her presence. 10 seconds. That's all it had taken to shatter every assumption in the room. This is the story of how a black woman mocked at a jiu-jitsu class submitted a champion black belt in just 10 seconds. But this moment of beautiful justice was just the culmination of something much deeper. A reckoning that had been building from the moment Helen first walked through those doors. Before we dive into how this incredible moment unfolded, let me ask you, have you ever been underestimated because of how you look? Have you ever walked into a space where people immediately decided what you were capable of, based on nothing more than your appearance? Drop a comment and let me know your experience, because Helen's story might feel all too familiar. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. Helen Albright had always been an enigma to those who thought they knew her. At 34, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that some mistook for aloofness. Her colleagues at the tech company where she worked as a senior software engineer saw her as the brilliant, reserved black woman who could debug impossible code but rarely joined them for after-work drinks. What they didn't know was that Helen had been training in martial arts since she was 7 years old. Her father, Marcus Albright, had been a Vietnam veteran who discovered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu during his recovery from PTSD in the late 1970s. For 27 years, Helen had trained with her father in their converted garage dojo. She had earned her black belt at 19, but Marcus had always kept her away from the competitive circuit. "Baby girl," he would say, "the world's going to try to tell you what you can and can't do based on what you look like. But on these mats, truth has a way of revealing itself." When Marcus passed away 6 months ago, Helen had felt lost. Her job transfer to Austin seemed like a blessing, a chance to find a new training community that might help fill the void her father's death had left. Elite Combat Academy occupied a converted warehouse in East Austin, its exterior painted matte black with intimidating silver lettering. The trophy cases, visible through large windows, displayed dozens of medals and photos of stern-faced competitors. The message was clear. This was a place for winners, for the elite. Helen sat in her Honda Civic for a moment, centering herself the way her father had taught her. Today, she would wear a brown belt instead of her black belt, not to deceive, but to observe. She wanted to see how the academy treated someone they perceived as less skilled. Her father had always said you could judge a martial arts school not by how they treated their champions, but by how they treated their beginners. The front desk was staffed by Linda, a blonde woman whose smile seemed practiced rather than genuine. Her eyes quickly scanned Helen from head to toe, and Helen caught the subtle shift in her expression, the slight tightening around the eyes, the way her smile became more forced. "Can I help you?" Linda asked, her tone polite but cool. "I'm interested in joining," Helen replied. "I have some experience in jiu-jitsu and was hoping to check out your advanced classes." Linda's eyebrows rose slightly. "Advanced classes are for brown and black belts only. What's your experience level?" "I've been training for about 15 years. I'm a brown belt." The skepticism in Linda's eyes was unmistakable. "Well, we do have a beginner's class starting in an hour. That might be more appropriate." Helen felt the familiar sting of assumption. "I appreciate the suggestion, but I'd really like to try the advanced class." Linda hesitated, then called for John Short, the head instructor. John emerged from the back office like a man accustomed to being the center of attention. At 42, he was still in excellent shape, his black belt worn with casual confidence. "So you're interested in our advanced program," John said, his tone friendly but with an undertone Helen recognized immediately. "Where did you train?" "Morgan Jiu-Jitsu Academy," she replied honestly, naming her father's home dojo. "Mostly with my father. Private instruction." John's expression shifted through various stages of polite skepticism. 15 years. That's impressive. Competition record? None. "My teacher believed in Jiu-Jitsu as self-improvement, not sport." John nodded slowly, and Helen could practically see the thoughts forming in his head. Private instruction. No competition record, no verifiable credentials from a real academy. "Well, I'll tell you what," John said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "Why don't you try our intermediate class first? The advanced class can be pretty demanding." The word demanding hung in the air like a challenge. Helen understood the subtext perfectly. "You don't belong here. I understand your concern," she said with a slight smile. "But I'm confident I can handle the advanced class." John's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He wasn't used to being politely contradicted, especially not by someone he had already categorized as beneath his academy's standards. "All right," he said finally, "but don't say I didn't warn you." The advanced class was already in session when Helen stepped onto the mats. The space was impressive. High-quality competition mats, professional lighting, and walls lined with photos of champions. But it was the atmosphere that struck her most. There was an edge to the energy, a tension that spoke of hierarchy and dominance rather than mutual learning. John stood at the center, demonstrating a complex guard pass to about 15 students. The demographics told a story. 12 men, 3 women, all white except for one Latino student. The women clustered together slightly, their body language suggesting they were used to being outnumbered. "Ah, our new student," John announced as Helen approached. "Everyone, this is Helen. She's joining us from... Where did you say you train?" "Private instruction," Helen replied, bowing respectfully before stepping onto the mat. "Right, private instruction," John repeated, and Helen caught the slight smirk that passed between him and several senior students. "Well, Helen, we do things differently here. This is a competitive academy. We train hard, we push each other, and we don't make excuses. Think you can handle that?" Helen simply nodded. "I'm here to learn." As they lined up by rank for warm-ups, Helen found herself next to Dean Martinez. At 28, Dean was the academy's golden boy, a 3-time state champion with an athletic build and pristine white gi. His posture radiated the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. "So, private instruction, huh?" Dean said during warm-ups. "That's interesting. Most serious practitioners come up through the competition circuit. Different paths, same destination," Helen replied diplomatically. Dean chuckled. "We'll see about that." The warm-up progressed through increasingly complex movements. Helen moved with fluid precision, her body remembering patterns drilled into muscle memory over decades of training. She noticed several students watching her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. "Not bad," commented Wells, a purple belt with swagger. "You've got some basics down." The condescension was unmistakable. Helen had seen this before, the way some martial artists used faint praise as subtle dominance. "Thanks," Helen replied simply, refusing to take the bait. As the class progressed, the microaggressions began to accumulate. Comments about street fighting versus technical jiu-jitsu, assumptions about her athletic background, suggestions that she might be more comfortable in women's-only classes. Each comment was individually deniable, but collectively, they painted a clear picture. During partner drilling, Helen was paired with Dustin, a brown belt who outweighed her by 60 pounds. Instead of working on technique, Dustin seemed determined to prove a point. His movements were unnecessarily rough, his pressure excessive. When Helen successfully defended his attempts, his frustration became visible. On his next attempt, Dustin drove his shoulder into Helen's ribs with enough force to knock the wind out of her. "Sorry," Dustin said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Guess I don't know my own strength." Helen caught her breath and reset, maintaining composure despite the obvious intent. She noticed John had been watching but chose not to intervene. When she was paired with Wells, things escalated further. Wells used his size advantage to muscle through techniques, abandoning proper form for brute force. When Helen successfully defended or countered, his frustration grew. "You're pretty slippery," Wells commented after Helen escaped his third submission attempt. "Must be all that natural athleticism." The pause before natural athleticism was loaded with implication. Helen felt the familiar sting of racial stereotyping. The assumption that her success came from innate physical gifts rather than years of dedicated training. "Technique beats strength," Helen replied evenly, echoing her father's favorite saying. Wells laughed. "We'll see about that." As the drilling session continued, Helen became aware that she had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Students were watching her interactions, waiting to see how she would handle the escalating aggression. Some seemed uncomfortable, but none spoke up. The silence of the bystanders was almost as damaging as the act of hostility. This was how the Academy's culture perpetuated itself, through the complicity of those who saw problems but chose not to address them. When John finally called time, Helen felt emotionally drained despite being physically fine. She had handled every challenge thrown at her, maintained her composure and technique, but the constant barrage had taken its toll. "Good work, everyone," John announced. "Helen, not bad for your first day. You've got some potential, though you'll need to work on your intensity if you want to keep up with our pace here." The backhanded compliment was the final straw. Helen had demonstrated superior technique, handled every challenge with grace, yet she was being told she needed to work on her intensity. But Helen had learned patience from her father. As the class began to wind down, she noticed Dean stretching near the edge of the mat, his championship medals catching the light. An idea began to form. Sometimes, the only way to change a culture was to shatter its foundational assumptions so completely that rebuilding became the only option. "Hey," she said, approaching Dean with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout. "I noticed you're a champion. I'd love to get some rounds in with someone at your level, if you're up for it." Dean looked up, surprise flickering across his features. Students didn't usually challenge him directly, especially not new students, who had just endured their first taste of the Academy's intensity. "You want to roll?" he asked. "After the day you've had?" Helen smiled. "Especially after the day I've had." Dean glanced around, noticing that several students had stopped their conversations to listen. The challenge had been issued publicly, and his reputation was now on the line. "All right," he said, standing and adjusting his belt. "But don't say I didn't warn you. I don't go easy on anyone." As word spread that the new student was about to spar with the Academy's champion, the entire class gathered around the mat. John positioned himself at the edge of the circle, his expression a mixture of anticipation and concern. This was either going to be a quick lesson in humility for the overconfident newcomer, or something far more interesting. Helen bowed respectfully and took her position across from Dean. As they touched hands to begin the match, she felt a familiar calm settle over her. The same centered focus her father had taught her to find in moments of challenge. Dean came forward aggressively, confident in his size and strength advantages. He had submitted dozens of opponents in competition, had built his reputation on his ability to impose his will through superior technique and conditioning. What he didn't expect was to find himself flying through the air less than 3 seconds into the match. Helen's throw was a thing of beauty, a perfectly timed hip toss that used Dean's forward momentum against him, sending him crashing to the mat with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. Before he could recover, Helen had transitioned smoothly to side control, her weight distributed perfectly to prevent his escape. Dean tried to bridge and roll, using the escape technique that had worked countless times before. But Helen anticipated his movement, flowing with his energy and transitioning seamlessly to mount position. The crowd had gone silent, watching in disbelief as their champion found himself completely dominated. 7 seconds had elapsed. Dean made one final desperate attempt to escape, trying to use his strength to power out of the position. It was exactly the wrong move against someone with Helen's expertise. She caught his arm as he reached up, secured her grip, and transitioned into a textbook armbar with fluid precision. 10 seconds. Dean's hand slapped the mat frantically, the universal signal of submission. Helen immediately released the hold and rolled away, bowing respectfully as she had been taught. The silence that followed was deafening. 30 seconds earlier, the room had been filled with confident chatter from students who thought they knew exactly how this encounter would unfold. Now, they stared in stunned disbelief at their champion, still lying on his back, staring at the ceiling as if trying to process what had just happened. Helen stood calmly adjusting her gi and retying her belt with methodical precision. Her expression remained neutral, professional, respectful, giving no indication that she had just accomplished something that should have been impossible. John was the first to break the silence. "Lucky shot," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Dean must have been tired from earlier training. But even as he spoke, John knew the words rang hollow. What they had witnessed wasn't luck or fatigue. It was technical mastery that came from decades of dedicated training, the kind of skill that couldn't be faked. Dean slowly sat up, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. He had been submitted before. Every serious martial artist had, but never like this. Never so quickly, so completely, so effortlessly. "Good natch," Helen said, extending her hand to help Dean to his feet. Her voice carried no trace of gloating, just respectful acknowledgement of one martial artist to another. Dean stared at her hand before accepting it, allowing her to pull him upright. As he stood, he found himself looking at Helen with entirely new eyes. The assumptions he had made, the casual dismissal of her abilities, the subtle condescension, all of it crumbled. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen smiled, and for the first time since entering the academy, it was genuine warmth rather than diplomatic politeness. "My father taught me that technique when I was 16, she said. He always said that the best way to deal with aggression was to redirect it back on itself. As the implication sank in, students began to murmur among themselves. If Helen could submit Dean, their champion, their standard-bearer, in 10 seconds, what did that say about her actual skill level? What did it say about the assumptions they had all made? What would you do in Helen's position? Would you have stayed silent or spoken up earlier? Let me know in the comments. The aftermath of Helen's 10-second submission created a ripple effect that spread through Elite Combat Academy like cracks in a foundation. In the immediate moments following the match, the gym had fallen into uncomfortable silence, broken only by students shifting nervously. John found himself in an impossible position. His entire business model was built on the premise that he and his chosen champions represented the pinnacle of martial arts excellence. Helen's effortless dismantling of Dean had shattered that narrative in less time than it took to tie shoes. "All right, everyone," John said, his voice carrying forced authority. "That's enough excitement for one day. Let's cool down and wrap up." But the students weren't ready to move on. They had witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about skill, hierarchy, and who belonged in their elite training environment. "That was incredible," said Wells, his earlier condescension replaced with genuine admiration. "Where did you learn that transition?" Before Helen could answer, John interjected, his pride wounded. "It was a fluke. Back to drilling, everyone. Collins, take a break. You look tired." The dismissal was transparent, an attempt to minimize what had just happened, but Helen simply bowed and stepped off the mat. As she walked toward her water bottle, she noticed several students watching her with newfound interest. Dean approached, clearly struggling with cognitive dissonance. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I made assumptions about you that were unfair." Helen studied his face, looking for sincerity. What she saw was genuine confusion and the beginning of self-reflection. "Apology accepted," she said. "But I'm curious. What assumptions did you make?" Dean shifted uncomfortably. "I guess I thought because you were new, because you didn't come from a competition background, because you were—" He trailed off. "Because I was black?" Helen asked gently, not accusingly, but with directness. Dean's face flushed. "I don't think of myself as racist." "Most people don't," Helen replied. "But racism isn't just about what we think of ourselves. It's about the assumptions we make, the expectations we have, the way we treat people before we know anything about them." John interrupted by clearing his throat loudly. "Helen, my office." Helen followed John toward the back of the gym. His office was exactly what she expected. Walls covered with photos of champions, shelves lined with trophies, and a large desk designed to intimidate. John gestured for her to sit while he positioned himself behind the desk, trying to re-establish authority. "So," John began, leaning back with forced casualness, "that was quite a performance out there." "It wasn't a performance," Helen replied calmly. "It was just training." John's jaw tightened. "Look, Helen, I'll be honest. What happened out there has created a situation. Dean is one of our top competitors, and having him submitted so quickly by a new student raises questions about our training standards." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Questions about your training standards or questions about your assumptions?" "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do," Helen said. "From the moment I walked in here, you and your students made assumptions about my skill level based on how I looked, not on any actual assessment of my abilities. When I exceeded those expectations, instead of examining why your initial judgments were wrong, you're looking for ways to minimize what happened." John leaned forward, his friendly facade slipping. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is a serious training facility. We have a reputation to maintain." "What kind of game?" Helen asked. "Coming in here, pretending to be less skilled than you are, making our students look bad. What's your angle?" Helen felt familiar weariness. Even when confronted with undeniable evidence of her skill, John's first instinct was to assume deception, rather than acknowledge his assessment had been wrong. "I'm a software engineer who just moved to Austin and was looking for a place to train," she said. "I never pretended to be less skilled. I told you I had 15 years of experience. You chose not to believe me." 15 years of private instruction isn't the same as real training," John shot back. "Competition experience, pressure testing. That's what separates real martial artists from weekend warriors." Helen stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. "Mr. Short, I came here hoping to find a training community that shared my father's values. Respect, humility, the pursuit of excellence through mutual support. What I found instead was a place where people are judged by their appearance rather than their character, where newcomers are hazed rather than welcome." "Now wait just a minute. I'm not finished," Helen said, her voice carrying quiet authority that made John fall silent. "You want to know about my training? My father was a Vietnam veteran who learned Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil in the 1970s. He trained with some of the original masters, men who understood that true martial arts were about more than just fighting. He spent 30 years teaching me not just techniques but the philosophy behind them." She paused, letting her words sink in. "He taught me that a black belt isn't just about what you can do to other people. It's about what you choose not to do. It's about using your skills to elevate others, not to dominate them." John's face had gone pale. "You're a black belt?" "I've been a black belt for 15 years, Helen confirmed. "I wore a brown belt today because I wanted to see how you treated someone you perceived as less skilled. I wanted to understand the culture of this place. The implications hung in the air. Every interaction Helen had experienced, every microaggression and assumption, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who she was." "Why didn't you just tell us?" John asked, his voice smaller now. "Would it have mattered?" Helen replied. "Would you have treated me with respect if you knew I was a black belt? Or would you have found other reasons to dismiss me?" John opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Helen's questions cut too close to thoughts he wasn't comfortable acknowledging. The truth is, Helen continued, the way you treat your beginners tells me everything I need to know about your character as an instructor. A true martial artist understands that everyone starts somewhere, and that our job is to help them grow, not tear them down. She moved toward the door, then paused. I'll be back tomorrow night. Not because I need to prove anything, but because I made a promise to my father. He believed that martial arts could be a force for positive change, but only if good people were willing to stand up and fight for what the art truly represents. And what's that? John asked quietly. Helen turned back to face him, and for a moment John saw past her calm exterior to the steel beneath. Respect, she said simply. For yourself, for your training partners, and for the art itself. Everything else is just ego. 6 months later, Helen pushed open the glass doors of what was now called Elite Submission Academy and Community Center, and smiled at the transformation before her. The walls, once covered exclusively with competition medals, now also displayed the principles her father had taught her: respect, humility, technical excellence, community. John, who had spent a week training with Helen after their initial encounter, had embraced the opportunity to return to the roots of the art he loved. His technical skill had never been in question. Only his teaching approach needed refinement. "Good morning, Professor Albright," called a teenage girl practicing drills in the corner, one of many female students who had joined since the academy's culture shift. Helen waved, setting down her bag and greeting the staff. The academy now offered sliding-scale memberships, anti-bullying programs for local schools, and women's self-defense classes taught with the same technical rigor as the competition teams. Dean emerged from the office, his demeanor noticeably changed from their first meeting. The aggressive edge had been replaced by confident calm. He had become one of Helen's most dedicated students, not just in technique, but in philosophy. "Ready for the seminar?" he asked, gesturing to the group of instructors from other academies gathering for Helen's workshop on inclusive teaching methods. "Always," she replied, adjusting her black belt, the one she now wore proudly with her father's name embroidered alongside her own. As the visitors settled on the mat, Helen caught sight of her father's photo, now hanging prominently by the entrance. She could almost hear his gentle voice. "The true victory in Jiu-Jitsu is not when you defeat others, but when you help them rise." She took her place at the front of the class and bowed deeply. The real work was just beginning. This story reminds us that we should never judge someone's capabilities based on their appearance. Have you ever witnessed discrimination like this? Share your story in the comments below. If stories like this inspire you to think differently about prejudice and resilience, make sure to subscribe to Timeless Memoir for more powerful stories that challenge us to be better. Remember, true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're standing alone.